Hebrew is most well known as the ancient language of the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible. For over a millennium, Hebrew was a dead language, used only in religious and liturgical contexts. But it was famously revived with the 19th century Zionist movement and the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. While several great videos have discussed the origins of Biblical Hebrew, the development of Hebrew writing and its influence on the modern Latin alphabet, or its revitalization in the modern day, the actual linguistic change that Hebrew underwent throughout antiquity has not been heavily discussed. In the nearly 1,000-year time span that Hebrew was written and spoken, Hebrew changed dramatically, to the point where Hebrew during the Hellenistic period would have been completely unrecognizable to its late Bronze Age ancestor. So this video will hope to provide an explanation of the history of Hebrew, specifically focusing on the linguistic and historical development of Hebrew as a spoken language, from the late Bronze Age until the death of Hebrew in the post-exillic period. Like all languages, Hebrew did not come to be out of a vacuum, but rather descended from an ancestor. Hebrew is part of the Semitic language family, which is a broad language family that includes a variety of languages such as Arabic, Akkadian, Ethiopian Ge'ez, and Sabian. However, more specifically, Hebrew belongs to a division of the Semitic language family known as Northwest Semitic, which includes Aramaic and Ugaritic, a language from the Bronze Age city of Ugarit in Syria. These were all once dialects of the same language, Northwest Semitic, but over time they became more divergent, similar to how Latin diverged into several languages such as French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. There were other languages within this language family, such as Amorite and Somalian, but they are poorly documented. But due to their very close relation to Hebrew and extensive documentation, Aramaic and Ugaritic provide key insights into the development of Hebrew. Not only do Aramaic and Hebrew belong to the same language family, but some linguists, such as Nama Pael and Aaron Wilson Wright, propose they possess an even more direct ancestor that branched off from other Northwest Semitic languages, Arameo-Canaanite, before they split off themselves and became their own distinct languages around 1400 BCE. However, before we proceed and discuss the development of Hebrew going into the Iron Age, we must discuss the relationship between Hebrew and Canaanite. Despite the common misconception rooted in the biblical texts that the Israelites and Canaanites were two remarkably different peoples and cultures, the archaeological, textual, and linguistic evidence suggests that the Israelites were Canaanites. There is no evidence that the Israelites were a foreign people who conquered the land, but rather, the evidence suggests that they emerged within Canaan at the end of the late Bronze Age. According to John Maxwell Miller, Israel seems to have emerged from the melting pot of peoples already in the land of Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age. Accordingly, their lifestyle and material culture were essentially Canaanite. There was very little difference between the two. The Canaanites and Israelites had a virtually identical material culture, lifestyle, religion, and most importantly for us today, language. Whether we like it or not, Hebrew is ultimately a Canaanite language, which developed from Canaanite going into the Iron Age. However, Canaanite transitioning to Hebrew underwent dramatic changes between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, to the point where it would be unrecognizable. 5 major changes occurred in Canaanite at the end of the late Bronze Age that are seen in biblical Hebrew. First and probably the most significant was the development of the alphabet. In the Bronze Age ancient Near East, the two most prominent writing systems were Mesopotamian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Both of these systems were logographic and syllabic, meaning every sign represented either a morpheme, a basic word unit, or a syllable. However, during the Middle Bronze Age, a writing system known as the Proto-Sinaitic script began to emerge in the Sinai Peninsula. The script was primarily developed, presumably, by Northwest Semitic workers working in Egyptian mines. The script was pictographic, borrowing from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it was an alphabet, with each pictograph representing a consonant that was represented by a word that began with that consonant. There were no vowels, a feature that would later be present in the Hebrew writing system. Although the Proto-Sinaitic writing system was not standardized or used in any sort of official context, but rather it was used by everyday Canaanite workers. However, another alphabet developed in the north, Ugaritic, a 30-letter alphabet influenced by both cuneiform and Proto-Semitic. While the Ugaritic writing system did not affect the Hebrew alphabet directly, it does display that alphabets were gradually being developed during this time period. This would eventually result in the development of the 22-letter Phoenician alphabet, which was then adopted by Hebrew and Aramaic. Second, the Canaanite shift. The Canaanite shift was a phonetic shift in Canaanite where the long A vowels, ah, shifted into long O vowels, o, which resulted in divergent pronunciations between Hebrew and the rest of the Semitic world. For example, shalom or shlama in Aramaic and salam in Arabic became shalom in Hebrew. But this vowel shift occurred very early in the history of Canaanite, as we possess Canaanite messages written in Mesopotamian cuneiform that display this vowel shift. Third, the development of the definite article. The definite article is a concept in language used to mark a noun as specific. In English, our definite article is the. The president has a different meaning from president or a president. In Hebrew, the definite article is expressed by the particle ha, which is attached to the noun. For example, the word for king melech becomes ha-melech, the king, with the definite article. But as hard as it is to believe, Hebrew did not have a definite article at one point, specifically during the Late Bronze Age. However, between the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, Hebrew began to develop a definite article. This was done by taking a demonstrative pronoun, ha, which means that, and placing it before a noun to mark it as a definite. Eventually, over time, it became a prefix attached to the word to itself, becoming what we see in Hebrew today. This also happened in Aramaic, but they placed the demonstrative ha at the end, becoming the suffix ah. So in Aramaic, the king became malka, not ha-melech. Fourth, the loss of case endings. Case markers are a method some languages use to denote grammatical case, the structure of a sentence, by grammatically marking the subject, known as the nominative, the object, known as the accusative, or a noun modifying another noun, the genitive. In English, we do not change the noun based on case, outside of pronouns, but other languages do, such as German, Greek, Arabic, and Akkadian. Like these languages, Hebrew used to also have case endings. In the Late Bronze Age, Hebrew had suffixes denoting grammatical case, gender, and number of the noun. These cases were primarily noted with vowel endings, and these would mark the grammatical case for each noun. For example, in Biblical and Modern Hebrew, if you want to say, the dog ate the plate of food, you would say, Achal ha-kelev et machavat ha-ochel. But in this system, you would say, Achal kavu machavatha akli. However, towards the end of the Late Bronze Age, these endings began to disappear. This was not just happening in Canaanite and Hebrew, but also in Ugaritic and Aramaic, as these endings were primarily inflective with short vowels, which were easily degraded over time, and by the time of Biblical Hebrew, they were gone. To compensate for the loss of case endings, Hebrew developed a direct object marker, et, which is a particle placed before a noun to denote it as a direct object. And this direct object marker is a hallmark of Biblical and Modern Hebrew. Fifth, the collapse of the yaqtul verb conjugation. In Hebrew, if you want to indicate the future tense, like English he will, you use the yaqtul conjugation, where the verb is prefixed, and if you want to use the past tense, you use the katal conjugation, where the verb is suffixed. However, this was not always the case, and in the Late Bronze Age, there were 5 renditions of the yaqtul verb changing its meaning and tense. You had the preterite tense yaqtul, denoting past actions, the imperfect yaqtulu, denoting incomplete actions, the jussive yaqtul, denoting wish, the volative yaqtula, expressing a desire or intention, or the energetic yaqtuluna, denoting an assertion or command. But these suffixes collapse at the end of the Late Bronze Age, resulting in all these meanings being present in one form, yaqtul, which would primarily become the imperfect, denoting future action. However, this ancient verb form is still preserved in the text of the Hebrew Bible. a verb construction known as the yaqtul form, which is the wa Hebrew's word for and, attached to an imperfect verb, is found throughout the narrative in the Hebrew Bible. But this verb construction does not refer to a future action like the way imperfect verbs are typically used, but actually narrates events in the past. So the addition of and completely changes the tense of the verb. Scholars previously had no idea why the yaqtul existed in Hebrew and speculated why this phenomenon occurred, until the discovery of more textual sources gave more light on the grammatical development of this form. Now we know that the yaqtul form is actually a remnant of this late Bronze Age suffix system preserved in the Bible. These 5 changes are just some of the linguistic developments that Bronze Age Canaanite would undergo to become what we know today as Biblical Hebrew. However, Hebrew was not the only language descended from Canaanite. Hebrew, along with Ammonite, Edomite, Moabite, Phonecian, and Punic, make up the languages and dialects that are called the Canaanite languages. While these descendants of Canaanite are often considered completely different languages to us modern readers, in reality, they were not separate languages, but rather dialects of the same language. There were, of course, differences in the dialects, and there was a dialectal continuum where the dialects gradually diverged between one another over space, with Hebrew and Phoenician being the most divergent of the dialects. But despite this, the Canaanite dialects were still mutually intelligible for most of the Iron Age. Compare that to Aramaic, which was unintelligible with Hebrew by 700 BCE. However, there were not just dialects between the Israelites, Phoenicians, Moabites, and others, but also dialects within Biblical Hebrew itself. The most notable of this was a dialectal difference between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, called Israelian and Judahite Hebrew by scholars. Israelian Hebrew was very distinctive from Judahite Hebrew. It had a different vocabulary, different spelling, variations in pronunciation, had an indefinite pronoun, and utilized a different feminine singular ending at instead of the ah ending in Biblical Hebrew. These differences between Israelian Hebrew and Judahite Hebrew were largely due to the Kingdom of Israel's location in the north, right next door to the Aramaeans. Thus, Israelian Hebrew received a lot of influence from Aramaic, as several Aramaic influences in Israelian Hebrew, known as Aramaisms, account for many of these differences between Israelian and Judahite Hebrew. Alongside Aramaic, Israelian Hebrew was also influenced by Phoenician, Moabite, and Ammonite, in contrast with Judahite Hebrew, which was more linguistically isolated due to its location, while northern Israel was interconnected with all these different languages and dialects. However, some scholars, such as Nama Pa'el, argue that Israelian Hebrew, as scholars define it, did not exist, and the difference between it and standard Biblical Hebrew found in the Bible are differences made by scholars, not actual dialectal variation. So, the debate is still ongoing. Regardless of whether Israelian Hebrew existed or not, the northern Israelites and their culture had a massive impact on the development of Hebrew. After the Assyrian conquest of Samaria, the capital of northern Israel, in 720 BCE, northern Israelite refugees poured into Judah. With the influx of northern Israelites into Judah, the Judahite monarchy incorporated them into the kingdom, and to do this, they created a common Israelite-Judahite identity. This resulted in many northern Israelites and Judahite traditions being brought together, which is ultimately seen in the Hebrew Bible, with the idea of a unified Israelite identity. Many books of the Bible, such as Amos, Hosea, Micah, and other biblical texts, such as liturgies, poetries, and narratives from northern Israel, were brought by these Israelite refugees and compiled in Judah. Soon, Judah was transformed from a rural backwater to an urbanized and scribal kingdom, with the influx of Israelites creating more settlements and providing a scribal culture not previously seen in Judah. As a part of creating a common Israelite-Judahite identity, Hebrew became more standardized, and this standardized version of Hebrew would become known as Standard Biblical Hebrew, being found throughout the biblical text. But this standardization of Hebrew was not unique to Judah. As Canaanite-speaking kingdoms arose, distinctive ethnic identities also came about, and as part of this, these kingdoms sought to distinguish themselves from one another. through language. Biblical Hebrew was a product of this, as Judahites sought to distinguish themselves from other Canaanite dialects. This is most notably seen with the development of a distinct script from the Phoenician alphabet known as Paleo-Hebrew. Ultimately, this is the background that Biblical Hebrew and even much of the Hebrew Bible was created in. Without it, the Old Testament and its language as we know it would not exist. In 587 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, sacked Jerusalem, destroying the temple, devastating the region of Judah, and taking many of the inhabitants of Judah into exile in Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian Exile, initiated dramatic changes in the Hebrew language. To quote Bill Schneidewin, quote, "The Babylonian exile is where the waters part in the history of the Hebrew language. It marks major changes to take place in the Hebrew speech and scribal communities during the 6th century BCE. Spoken Hebrew was not unscathed by the conquest, yet it would survive. But Standard Biblical Hebrew disappears by the end of the 6th century BCE. Before the exile, Standard Biblical Hebrew was the literary language of Judah, primarily used by the upper class, but Standard Biblical Hebrew had begun to diverge from the everyday speech of normal Judahites. So a disparity between the writing of the elites and the speech of the common people had begun to emerge. During the exile, many of the elites were taken to Babylon. In Babylon, with Aramaic spreading rapidly, becoming the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, these exiles were primarily educated within an Aramaic context, not Hebrew. Thus, the written Hebrew of the pre-exilic upper class died out, as Aramaic became the preferred administrative and scribal language of the Babylonian and later the Persian Empire. In fact, parts of the Bible, such as Daniel chapters 2-7 and Ezra chapters 4-6, and one verse in Jeremiah 10, are written in Aramaic for this reason. However, the end of Standard Biblical Hebrew resulted in a complete reset in how Hebrew functioned and developed going into the Persian period, as the exiles returned home. This version of Hebrew that emerged out of the exile is known as Late Biblical Hebrew. Late Biblical Hebrew was the primary dialect used in Ezra and Nehemiah, Chronicles, Daniel, Ecclesiastes, Jonah, Song of Solomon, Esther, and some Psalms. Some of these authors attempted to replicate pre-exilic works by using some language from Standard Biblical Hebrew. However, even though many of these works attempted to follow pre-exilic language, Hebrew still underwent massive changes. These changes were largely due to the influence of Imperial Aramaic, which was not just the administrative language during the Persian period, but became the spoken language of Persian Judea. Two notable changes characterized this period of Hebrew. First and most notable, Hebrew underwent grammatical changes largely influenced by Aramaic. New verbal forms were added, and older verb forms such as the yaqtul disappeared. The word order or syntax was also very different from previous periods of Hebrew. Noun declension also changed, and new prepositions, conjunctions, and adverbs were added, or their meanings were altered. All of these changes were due to the influence of Aramaic, as these are traits typically seen in Aramaic writing during this time period as well. Additionally, loanwords were taken from Aramaic, Akkadian, Greek, and Persian due to the exile, and were most likely transmitted to Hebrew through Aramaic. The second change was a change in the writing system. During the Persian period, Hebrew began to use the Aramaic script instead of Paleo-Hebrew, due to it widely being used in the ancient Near East. This is most notably seen in Hebrew to this day, as the Hebrew alphabet as we know it is a descendant of this Aramaic script. Additionally, because both the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabet have no vowels, during this time period, Hebrew began to more commonly use the consonants Y, W, H, and Aleph to represent certain vowels. This practice is known as plain A spelling, and these vowel letters are known as mater lectionis. While Hebrew literature was still being written during this period, this is where we start to see the spoken language of Hebrew becoming less and less used in daily life. Outside of contemporary biblical texts being written in Hebrew, we see very little evidence of Hebrew being spoken during the Persian period. There are no inscriptions dating to the Persian period written in Hebrew, but we have plenty of inscriptions written in Aramaic. This is even evidenced by the book of Nehemiah, which describes how the children of Jews during this time, quote, could not speak the language of Judah, i.e. Hebrew, and when the Torah was read, it had to be translated into Aramaic for the people to understand it. There were possibly still some Hebrew-speaking communities in Persian Judea, but they were isolated, most likely located in the Judean hill country, an area which would have not been exposed to Aramaic as much. But outside these communities, Aramaic was the dominant spoken language. Hebrew was not. While Hebrew was declining as a spoken language, by the late Persian and early Hellenistic period, Hebrew began to have a new meaning for Jewish identity. Hebrew became a symbol of identity for Jews in Persian and Hellenistic Judea, and the Jewish community in the diaspora. In the late Persian period, official coins of the Persian province of Yehud were minted in Hebrew, not Aramaic. Hebrew later served as a religious language and a symbol of ethnic identity and national independence with the rise of the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty, which used Hebrew as a connection to the past age of ancient Israel and the kingdom of David and Solomon. Furthermore, Hebrew literature flourished as literary works were produced during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, and scribal schools dedicated to Hebrew study were established. Thus, the Jewish community became bilingual beginning in the Persian period all the way until the end of the Roman period, and arguably even modern day. Aramaic became the spoken language, and while Hebrew as a spoken language declined, it was solidified as a religious and literary language, a symbol of Jewish identity. However, Hebrew was likely still a living and spoken language in some small and isolated towns in Roman Palestine, all the way until the 3rd century AD. We see a similar phenomenon today with Syriac and Neo-Aramaic still being spoken in small isolated villages in Syria, even after 1,000 years of Arabic being the dominant language. It was only after several Jewish revolts against Rome, most notably the Bar Kokhba revolt, that the population was displaced, and Hebrew as a living and spoken language died out completely. While Hebrew as a spoken language disappeared, its literary significance continued through Jewish rabbinic tradition and the Masoretes' preservation of the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew's continued religious and ethnic importance eventually led to its revitalization in the 20th century, where it is now a living language spoken by 6 million native speakers. And this modern language is very similar to its Iron Age ancestor found in the Bible.